I remember the first time I noticed it, just a flicker of something off. Sarah, my wife of 10 years, was sitting across from me at the dinner table. She was smiling, telling me about her day at the bank, but her words felt rehearsed, her laughter a fraction too light. A flicker became a flame that night when I saw her glance at her phone as though it were a lifeline. The name Jessica lit up on the screen. Her best friend? Maybe. But the way her lips curved into a secretive smile, that was new. At first, I dismissed it. I had no reason not to trust her. Sarah had always been the steady one, calm, composed, and reliable. But the next few weeks were different. Late nights at work. Weekend brunches with friends I'd never heard of. Perfumes I didn't recognize. The first real crack came on a Thursday night. She was in the shower, and her phone buzzed on the bedside table. I didn't mean to look, but when you live a life like mine, instinct sometimes overrules morality. The text read, "Can't stop thinking about tonight. See you at 7. Jay." My chest tightened. I'd seen my share of betrayal. In my line of work as an FBI agent, deceit is just part of the job. But I wasn't prepared for it to touch my personal life. I didn't confront her, not yet. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that people reveal their truths when they think you're not watching. The next few days I became just that, a watcher. I started tracking her movements. Nothing invasive, just enough to gather pieces of the puzzle. The friend brunches were dinners at upscale restaurants. The long hours at work were anything but. But it wasn't until I saw her at La Vino, a place we used to celebrate anniversaries, sitting across from a man I'd never seen before, that the spark turned into a blaze. His hand brushed hers. Her laughter rang out like a bell. And I, sitting unnoticed in the corner, felt the sting of a truth I wasn't ready to face. That night, when she came home, I pretended to be asleep. I could smell his cologne faintly lingering on her clothes. She crawled into bed beside me as though nothing had happened, her breathing soft and steady. And as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I knew two things. Sarah was hiding something, and whatever it was tied to the man in that restaurant. But this wasn't just about a betrayal of the heart. My gut told me there was more, a darkness I hadn't yet uncovered. And so the silent game began. I was no longer just her husband. I was her shadow, her observer, her judge. What she didn't know was that her betrayal had awakened something in me, something she'd never seen. And soon, she wouldn't recognize the man she thought she knew. The next morning, Sarah moved around the house as if nothing had changed, her usual grace masking the cracks in her story. She kissed me on the cheek before heading out, her bag slung over her shoulder. "Don't wait up tonight," she said with a smile. "Work might run late." Her words were like ash in my mouth. She was lying to my face, and we both knew it. I forced a smile, the kind I'd perfected in countless undercover operations. "Of course," I replied, watching her leave. Once the door clicked shut, I sprang into action. I wasn't just a betrayed husband. I was an FBI agent with years of experience tracking down criminals who thought they were smarter than everyone else. If Sarah thought she could outmaneuver me, she had no idea who she was dealing with. Her phone was the first clue. She'd been careful, deleting most of her messages, but no one covers their tracks perfectly. Using software I'd installed earlier, I recovered fragments of her conversations. The name Jay appeared again and again, along with coded messages that hinted at more than just a sordid affair. Words like transfer, timing, and clean stood out. This wasn't just a betrayal, it was a conspiracy. I followed her that evening, my car a shadow trailing hers. She didn't go to the bank or anywhere near her supposed work. Instead, she pulled into the driveway of an opulent mansion on the edge of the city. I parked a safe distance away, slipping into the cover of darkness as I watched her greet a tall, well-dressed man on the front steps. He was charismatic, with a smile that would disarm most people. But I recognized the type, slick, calculated, and dangerous. This had to be Jay. They didn't stay outside long. After a brief exchange, they disappeared inside, and the windows of the mansion glowed with muted light. I knew better than to follow them inside. Instead, I planted a small listening device near the entrance as I passed by, blending in with the shadows. Back in my car, I listened to their muffled conversation through my earpiece. At first, it was trivial, soft laughter, murmured words. But then the tone shifted. "Are you sure he doesn't suspect anything?" the man, Jay, asked. "Michael?" "No," Sarah replied with a confidence that sent a cold wave through my chest. "He's as oblivious as ever." Her words stung, but I forced myself to focus. Their conversation turned to money, bank accounts, and names I recognized from ongoing investigations. Jay wasn't just her lover. He was deeply involved in a money laundering scheme I'd been investigating for months. When Sarah finally left the mansion, I tailed her again, but my mind was already racing ahead. The woman I had loved, trusted, and built a life with wasn't just betraying me. She was part of something far bigger and far more dangerous. That night, as she crawled into bed beside me, I kept my breathing steady, my eyes closed. I couldn't confront her, not yet. She thought she was untouchable, but she didn't know what was coming. I wasn't just going to expose her secrets. I was going to unravel her entire world. The days that followed were an exercise in restraint. I had the means to confront Sarah then and there, to lay all the evidence before her and demand answers. But that wasn't the plan. If I'd learned anything from years of undercover work, it was that patience often dealt the sharpest blow. Sarah's behavior became a study for me, each movement a clue, each word a potential lie. She thought she was subtle, but to a trained observer, she might as well have been shouting her secrets. The way she flinched when her phone buzzed at dinner, the faint trace of an unfamiliar cologne on her scarf, the expensive wine she'd ordered online, a brand she once claimed was too pretentious. One evening, as she sat scrolling through her laptop, I noticed her expression shift ever so slightly, lips tightening, eyes darting. Her screen reflected in the glass of the living room window, and I caught a glimpse of an encrypted email account open in her browser. She quickly closed it when she realized I was watching, offering a nervous laugh. "Just some bank work," she said, her voice light but her hands trembling. I played my part, of course. "You work too hard," I said, brushing a kiss against her forehead. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. The cracks in her facade grew deeper when she announced she'd be heading out for a team-building retreat over the weekend. It wasn't unusual for her job, but something about the timing felt wrong. I offered to drive her to the airport, but she insisted on taking a cab. Another red flag. After she left, I did what I'd been trained to do. I searched. It wasn't hard to find the hidden compartment in her closet, an old shoebox tucked beneath layers of clothes. Inside were items that didn't fit the Sarah I thought I knew. A burner phone, several flash drives, and a ledger filled with names and numbers. The ledger was the key. At first glance, it seemed like a simple record of transactions, but the amounts were staggering. A closer look revealed connections to known shell companies and offshore accounts. The more I pieced together, the clearer it became. Sarah wasn't just involved in Jay's schemes. She was deeply entrenched. When she returned from her retreat, I was waiting, not with accusations, but with carefully planned questions. "How was the retreat?" I asked over dinner. "Oh, the usual. Trust falls and icebreakers," she said, her fork clinking against her plate. "And where did you say it was again?" "Seattle," she replied without missing a beat. But her face betrayed her. Just a flicker of uncertainty, quickly masked. I smiled, nodding. "Must have been exhausting." She let out a relieved laugh, oblivious to the fact that I'd already checked the flight logs. There was no record of her flying to Seattle or anywhere else. As I lay in bed that night, listening to her steady breathing, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Anger, sadness, betrayal, but above all, a cold determination. The truth was unraveling piece by piece. And soon Sarah would realize the depth of the game she was playing, and just how outmatched she was. The morning light spilled through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. Sarah sat at the breakfast table, scrolling through her phone, sipping her coffee as though everything was perfectly normal. I watched her from the kitchen, my own cup untouched. It was strange the way routine could mask so much chaos beneath the surface. I decided to test the waters. "You seemed tired last night," I said casually, taking a seat across from her. "That retreat must have been intense." She looked up, startled for just a moment before slipping on that familiar smile. "Oh, it was. Long days, lots of group activities. But it was worth it." "Did you get a chance to see much of Seattle?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. "Not really," she said quickly. "We were stuck in the conference center most of the time." I nodded, pretending to accept her answer. But the flicker of tension in her expression was enough. She was walking a tightrope, and she knew it. Later that day, I took my next step. While she was at work, I contacted an old friend in cybersecurity who owed me a favor. I handed him Sarah's burner phone and asked him to extract everything he could. Within hours, he sent me a report that left no doubt. Sarah wasn't just a bystander in Jay's operation. She was actively helping him move millions through accounts she had access to at her bank. The messages between her and Jay were a mix of personal and professional. At times, they spoke like lovers, sharing stolen moments and plans for their next meeting. At other times, the tone shifted, cold, calculating, discussing numbers and logistics. That evening, I waited for her to come home. When she walked through the door, she greeted me with a kiss, her smile as bright as ever. "How was your day?" she asked, setting her purse down. "Busy," I replied, watching her closely. "Yours?" "Oh, the usual," she said, slipping off her shoes. "Meetings, reports, the never-ending grind." I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all. She lied so effortlessly, weaving stories that barely scratched the surface of truth. But I wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. Instead, I let the silence grow between us, each unspoken word hanging heavy in the air. That night, as she showered, I took another look at the ledger I'd found in her closet. The names, the accounts, the amounts, they painted a picture of corruption so vast it was almost impressive. Almost. When she came to bed, she slipped under the covers and curled against me. Her warmth a cruel reminder of the woman I thought I'd married. "Good night," she whispered, her voice soft and sincere. I didn't respond. My mind was elsewhere, calculating my next move. The abyss between us had grown too wide to ignore, and soon, she would realize just how deep it went. The days rolled on, and Sarah continued to live her carefully constructed lie. She didn't know I was watching, listening, piecing together every fragment of her betrayal. But the more I uncovered, the more I realized this wasn't just about her infidelity. Sarah had become entangled in something dangerous, something bigger than either of us. Through surveillance and my own investigations, I confirmed Jay's full name, Joshua Grayson. He wasn't just a wealthy businessman. He was a key player in an international money laundering network, funneling millions through shell corporations and offshore accounts. The irony was almost laughable. Sarah, the woman I trusted most, was now tangled in a case I'd been working on for months. The realization wasn't just a gut punch. It was a call to action. I couldn't afford to let my emotions cloud my judgment. If I played this wrong, I'd lose everything. Not just my marriage, but the opportunity to take down one of the most elusive criminal networks I'd ever encountered. That evening, Sarah announced she'd be meeting with an old friend for dinner. She didn't bother to elaborate, and I didn't press her. Instead, I nodded, my face a mask of indifference, and watched her leave. The moment the door shut behind her, I sprang into action. I'd planted a tracker on her car days ago, knowing this moment would come. Following at a safe distance, I tailed her to an upscale restaurant on the edge of town. Through the tinted windows, I saw her seated at a private booth with Joshua. Their body language spoke volumes. Leaning close, exchanging whispers, laughing like conspirators. But it wasn't the intimacy that struck me. It was the tension. There was a sharpness to their movements, a hint of unease in Sarah's expression that hadn't been there before. I slipped into the restaurant unnoticed, taking a seat near the bar with a clear view of their table. Joshua was speaking in low tones, his hands gesturing as he emphasized something. Sarah nodded, her face pale but determined. I strained to catch snippets of their conversation, but the noise of the restaurant made it impossible. After an hour, they stood to leave. I waited a moment before following them out, careful to stay hidden. Outside, I saw them exchange a few final words before parting ways. Joshua drove off in his sleek black car, and Sarah lingered for a moment, her face etched with worry. Back at home, she slipped into the house as though nothing had happened. I watched her carefully, noting the way her shoulders sagged and her steps faltered. Something was weighing on her. "Good dinner?" I asked casually as she walked into the living room. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. "Yeah, it was nice to catch up." Her voice was steady, but her hands betrayed her. They trembled as she poured herself a glass of wine, and I knew she was unraveling. The game was shifting. Joshua was starting to feel the pressure from my investigation, and it was clear Sarah was caught in the crossfire. What she didn't know was that I was the one tightening the noose. I went to bed that night with a singular thought. The time for observation was coming to an end. It was time to make my move. The next morning, the tension in the air was palpable. Sarah moved around the house with a forced calm, her usual grace replaced with a rigidity that betrayed her unease. I watched her carefully, pretending to be engrossed in the morning news, my coffee growing cold in my hands. She glanced at me as she gathered her things for work. "You're quiet this morning," she said, her tone light but her eyes cautious. "Just tired," I replied with a faint smile. "Long week." She nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line as she slung her bag over her shoulder. "Well, don't work too hard." I watched her leave, the door clicking shut behind her, and waited until I saw her car disappear down the street. Then I got to work. The burner phone I'd recovered from her closet had been a goldmine of information. Alongside encrypted emails and coded messages, it contained a few audio files, recordings of conversations between her and Joshua. Most were about logistics, transferring money, and keeping their operation under the radar. But one stood out. In it, Sarah's voice was shaking, her tone a mix of fear and defiance. "You promised this wouldn't spiral out of control," she said. Joshua's reply was cold, measured. "And it won't as long as you do your part. We're too far in to back out now." Her sharp intake of breath sent a chill through me. "If Michael finds out," she began, but Joshua cut her off. "Then you'll handle it. He's not a problem." I clenched my fists, the words reverberating in my mind. Not a problem. It was as if my entire existence had been reduced to a minor inconvenience. Later that day, I made a decision. It was time to step out of the shadows, to let Sarah feel the weight of the walls closing in. But I wouldn't confront her outright, not yet. Instead, I'd let the cracks in her mask widen until she couldn't hide behind it anymore. That evening, I cooked dinner, a gesture she always appreciated. When she walked in, the aroma of roasted chicken and garlic greeted her, and for a moment her guard slipped. "This is a nice surprise," she said, setting her bag down and taking a seat at the table. I poured her a glass of wine, watching her closely. "I figured we could use a quiet night in." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. As we ate, I steered the conversation toward her day, her work, her friends. She answered my questions with practiced ease, but there was a tension in her voice, a subtle hesitation that hadn't been there before. "Do you ever feel like you're carrying too much?" I asked suddenly, my tone casual but my eyes locked on hers. She blinked, startled by the question. "What do you mean?" "Just life," I said, swirling the wine in my glass. "Sometimes it feels like everything's heavier than it should be." For a moment I thought she might crack. Her eyes darted to the side, her fingers tightening around her fork. But then she smiled, a brittle, forced expression. "I guess we all have our burdens." As the evening wore on, I let the silence stretch between us, letting her sit with her thoughts. By the time she went to bed, I could see the strain etched into her features. She was unraveling, and I knew it was only a matter of time before she slipped. I stayed up late that night, staring at the burner phone and the ledger, the pieces of her betrayal spread out before me. The game was accelerating, and soon the final act would begin. The following day, I made my move. I placed the burner phone back in Sarah's closet, knowing she would find it. She'd be on edge, unsure if it had been tampered with but too paranoid to ask. I wanted her to feel the pressure. At dinner, I mentioned casually, I was thinking about organizing the closet this weekend. We've got so much old stuff piling up. Her fork froze halfway to her mouth. Oh, I don't think there's much to sort through, she said quickly, her voice tight. I shrugged, letting the moment hang in the air before changing the subject. Her tension was palpable, and I knew she'd be checking that box the moment I left the room. That night, I pretended to fall asleep early, listening as she crept to the closet. The faint rustle of clothes confirmed she was checking her hiding place. She was spiraling, and I was tightening the web around her. The next phase was set. Soon, the lies would catch up to her. The following week, I started noticing Sarah's nervous glances, the way she fidgeted when she thought I wasn't looking. She was unraveling, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. But it wasn't enough. I needed more. One evening, as she left for work, I slipped into her office and accessed her laptop. The keycard that she'd carelessly left lying on her desk unlocked her email account. Another thread in the web. I found detailed reports of financial transactions between her and Jay. It was all there. Laundered money, offshore accounts, names I recognized from my investigations. As I scrolled through the files, my mind raced. I had the proof now, solid and irrefutable. But it wasn't time to confront her. Not yet. I put everything back in place, making sure she wouldn't notice the intrusion. As I closed the door behind me, I felt a cold determination. The game was almost over, and Sarah was about to learn just how far I was willing to go. The next few days felt like a countdown, each second ticking louder in my ears. I could feel the storm brewing, the inevitable moment when everything would come crashing down. But I needed to wait. Sarah had to make the first move, not me. On the evening of the next confrontation, as I prepared dinner, I received a call from a contact at the bank. The records were coming through. The transfer to Jay's account had been successfully completed, and Sarah was directly involved in it. When Sarah walked through the door, she was unusually quiet. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed with the weight of something she could no longer hide. I turned to her slowly, the tension in the room almost unbearable. I know about the money, Sarah. Her breath caught. What are you talking about? Everything, I said softly. The accounts, the transfers. Jay, your betrayal. Her lips trembled, but she stayed silent, her gaze fixed on the floor. I could feel her heart race in the silence, her fear palpable. I never wanted it to come to this, I whispered, walking toward her. But now you don't have a choice. The storm was here, and now it was time for her to face the consequences. Sarah stood frozen, her back against the wall as I took a step closer. Her eyes were wide, darting between the phone in my hand and my face. How much do you know? She whispered, her voice trembling. I know enough, I replied, keeping my tone even. Enough to ruin everything you've built, to expose the lies. The money laundering, the affair. It's all out in the open now, Sarah. Her hands shook as she reached for the wine glass on the table, taking a shaky sip. You don't understand. This isn't just about me. It's bigger. Jay, he promised me. Don't, I interrupted. You made your choices. You're in this, and so am I now. But you still don't get it, do you? You thought you were in control, but all along, I've been watching you. Everything you did, I was one step ahead. Her eyes narrowed. You've known all this time? I nodded. From the beginning. For the first time, I saw the mask crack. She staggered back, her breath quickening. You're going to ruin me, aren't you? No, I said. You've already done that yourself. The silence between us was deafening. I knew what needed to be done, but Sarah's vulnerability caught me off guard. There was a part of me, the part that had once loved her, that wanted to help her escape it all. But it was too late for that. You have two choices, I said, finally breaking the silence. You turn on Jay and help me take him down, or I send everything to the authorities. Every last detail. You won't just lose your job, Sarah. You'll lose everything. She stared at me, her mind racing. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the fear and guilt, but also the desperation. It wasn't enough to make her choose the right thing. I need time, she whispered. I turned and walked away. Time's up. It was over. The game was finished. The next few days were filled with tension that I could feel in every corner of the house. Sarah's silence weighed heavily between us, and despite my calm exterior, I was calculating my next move. She knew the stakes now. She knew what I was capable of. Then the call came. It was Sarah, and for the first time in days, her voice was steady. "I'll do it," she said. "I'll give you everything. But I need your word. You won't involve the authorities. I'll handle it with Jay, but you have to promise me." I paused, the weight of her request pressing down on me. Part of me wanted to refuse, to see her fall as she had made me fall. But then I thought about the man I used to be, the one who was willing to sacrifice everything for the greater good. Was I really so far gone that I couldn't extend a shred of mercy? "I promise," I said, my voice cold, but laced with something else. Something I didn't want to acknowledge. "I'll meet him tonight," Sarah continued, her voice now almost a whisper. "I'll get him alone. It'll be over." I wanted to ask her if she truly believed it would be that easy, but I knew better. This wasn't about ending the chapter. This was about survival. That night I followed her. It was a risk. She didn't know I was tailing her, but I couldn't let her walk into this alone. When she met Jay at a secluded spot near the docks, I watched from a distance. The confrontation was quiet, tense. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw their body language. The way Sarah stood tall for the first time in days. The way Jay's smug expression shifted as he realized he was no longer in control. It didn't take long. Moments later, Sarah's phone flashed, and I knew the evidence was sent. She'd done it. When she returned home, her eyes met mine, and for a moment, there was no need for words. She had chosen the path of redemption, or at least the one that would save her. The next morning, I made a call. I kept my word, no authorities, no exposure. But the message was clear. And as I watched Sarah leave the house one last time, I couldn't help but wonder how long it would take before the walls she built for herself started to crumble again. How long before the choices we made would come back to haunt us. Sometimes the price of betrayal isn't just the loss of trust. It's the cost of everything you thought you had. I hope the story resonates with you. If you enjoyed it, leave a comment and share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat.